Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this coffee break webinar series on perspective tile scoping. My name is Matthew Long, and I'm joined today by Richard Benwell.
Hi, Matthew. How you doing?
I'm very good, thank you. Back from MMS, nice and
Oh,
rested.
yeah, that was a good show.
So today we're going to be looking at perspective tile scoping. Doesn't sound like the most intriguing of topics, but it's certainly something that's quite key to leveraging perspectives properly in squared up v3. Okay, let's get started. So basically what we're going to be looking at today at a top level is getting the most of our perspectives by sort of avoiding that problem of having to rescope tiles all the time. But actually more concretely what we're doing is enabling you to take a dashboard or take a perspective and show other objects related to whatever context we're currently viewing. So if I'm looking at a server, how can I see components related to that? Because we know SCOM is a component-based system. There are an awful lot of objects being discovered, and typically what information we want isn't necessarily always on the thing we're actually looking at. Now, to do that, we're going to have to actually understand the SCOM component-based model. So the first thing we're going to have to do is kind of take a bit of a 101 on how SCOM represents health information, how it relates to all its different components, and really understand that whole architecture. And then we can start looking at using squared up to really take advantage and really leverage that.
Yep. Great. And so we've sort of looked at perspectives in the past. Is it worth sort of bringing up the product right now and having a quick look? So I guess in previous coffee breaks, we looked at adding in service manager data, for example, into a new perspective on top of Windows servers and so on. Really, like the main purpose of perspectives is to be able to pull in related monitoring data from SCOM for any particular server. So given a server or any other object, you've got lots of information, but you really want to present it in a way that makes sense for your users, and that's what a perspective is. But as you say, what we really need to understand is not just that there's a single object in SCOM, one per server, but there's actually many different objects in SCOM for every server, and we need to sort of be able to traverse that and display that data on the screen. Okay.
This is a pretty typical example of that, actually. So I'm looking at a server. You can see at the top there, Scrup OPP Web 01, so that is a Windows server. And, you know, a typical user doesn't necessarily care that, well, SCOM's actually got this object model and blah, blah, blah. They want to see disk information. So when I click on the disk perspective, as far as they can tell, they're now able to see disk information for that server. What's actually happening in the background here is that squared up, or this perspective, has been configured to say, take whatever server you're given and then look at its child objects. You'll find disks there. Show me information for those disks instead. So we can see here, I can see the health state information for the child disks of the server. In this case, it's got 2 disks. And I can also see performance metrics for the disks, not for the computer, because the computer object has no idea, you know, what disk free space or anything else might be.
And this is fundamental to making these perspectives templates that can be shown dynamically for any server you get to. So you don't want to say always show C on SquapOp Web 01. You want to say show all disk drives found sort of relative to this server. So it's important to kind of understand how to make that dynamic and how to be expressing what you want to show relative to the object, the sort of the context of the perspective.
Right, and you might think, okay, why do I need this? I can just keep drilling down all the time to different disks and things. But that sort of drill down, every time you drill down, you're constantly changing context, right? So you look at something, okay, now I need to go back up to its parent to look at the alert again and see, okay, actually now I'm down here on the disk and the disk's filling up, but is that impacting anything else? We'll go back up to the server object. So this isn't just like a navigation hack. This is really sort of enabling a fast, modern workflow when working with SCOM.
Great. So you said we need a 101 on SCOM, the SCOM object model. So
yeah, let's dive into that.
What do we need to know?
So what we basically need to know is that in SCOM, health is represented by lots of different objects. So it's a component-based monitoring system. So rather than having just like a understanding of servers and network devices and that's it, SCOM cares about a component, whatever that is, and its relationships to other components. So what that basically means, using SCOM lingo, is that SCOM models objects like computers, disks, and groups. So not just simple things, but really any CI you can think of. So server roles, like the fact that this is an IIS server, that's modeled as its own object as well. It's a standalone entity by itself. So is a website, so is a database. All those things are individual objects. We can put dashboards against them. We can target alerts at them. All of those objects have a class, which is really like a type or a sort of template that tells SCOM, okay, whenever you find a computer, this is what it's going to look like. It will have these properties, and this is how it relates to other objects inside the hierarchy. So for example, a computer is actually a specialized type of computer is Microsoft Windows computer. So we have a similar Microsoft Unix computer class for Unix computers. And people can create their own as well. So if I had some other sort of system, maybe I wanted to create containers in SCOM, I could start creating those and have my .container.computer. Likewise with disks, You have a very abstract sort of Windows disk, and then you have very specific ones down to, this is the disk you'll find on Windows Server 2012. And again, this is important for perspectives because it means if you're creating a perspective and say, this is actually only applicable on 2016 servers, say, you can target that perspective at Microsoft Windows .computer.server.2016, and it'll only apply to those, not the more so not the other versions. But if you target it low down at like system.computer, it'll apply to everything, Windows, Unix, whatever. And at the bottom there we have system.group. That is actually the class for groups inside SCOM. Everything in SCOM has a class. So you'll also find that for groups. DAs are the same. They just have their own class called system.service. And those classes will define the properties you see as well. So when you go and look on the Monolith Identity tab and you see like, there's a disk, it's got this label, it's got this much free space, this much capacity, that kind of thing. Those are all properties on that object.
So objects are things and a class is a type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very simple. And then the final thing you have to understand is that classes can be related to each other. Now there's two types of relationships.
I'm going to ask here
Go on.
Whether this slide's right. Is it classes or is it objects?
So classes are related. Oh yeah, so that's true. That's a typo on the slide. So classes can be related to one or more other classes.
Yeah.
And then once those classes are related, those objects can have that sort of relationship instance created.
Yeah.
That's a bit sort of inside baseball. The important thing to bear in mind here basically is there's two types of relationship. There's containment relationships, which are where you say one thing contains another thing, but they're actually quite independent. So the classic example of this in SCOM would be a SCOM group contains computers. If you wanted a sort of technology-based example outside of SCOM, the best one would be like Active Directory groups and users. A user can be in a group, but it can also be in 10 other groups at the same time. It's not specifically targeted to that one group, and it could also be in no groups, and that user account would work just fine. The other relationship type is hosting. Hosting is a bit more complicated, but essentially when you have two objects that are hosted, what you're saying is the top level objects, like a computer hosts the disks. Those disks are really part of that computer. If that computer ever goes away for any reason, those disks should now cease to exist. This is actually, incidentally, how SCOM is very easily able to clean up stuff when you remove an agent from a system, because when you yank the computer out of SCOM, everything that was hosted upon it disappears as well because it's tied to its lifetime.
And I guess actually it just occurred to me when you see an alert or perhaps people are looking at objects, they might often see a path.
Yes.
You see the object path and then the object name, and actually the path is derived from the hosting relationship. So if the C drive is on a computer, then the computer is part of the path, whereas in containment you don't see the group name, for example, as part of that containment relationship.
Exactly, because in the case of hosting, you're only allowed to have one hosting parent. So this disk exists on this computer and no other computers. It makes up part of its unique ID effectively.
All right, so objects, classes, and relationships.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to show an example slide here that just kind of paints this picture a little bit. It's not super exciting, but so imagine we have our all Windows computers group at the top. That object is of type system.group, as we can see over here in the white. It will have a containment relationship to lots of different computers. They will be of type Microsoft Windows Computer. They'll actually be of a slightly more specialist class, but for our example here, Microsoft Windows Computer is fine. And that will contain all your Windows computers. So those are all contained within. Those computers could be in other groups as well. Likely they will be. But for this purpose here, they're inside that group. And then if we look at our disk drive has a hosting relationship to our computer. And will be of type Microsoft Windows Logical Disk. So that says that this C drive exists on this particular computer, not on any other computers. And likewise, its identity, if you look at its path for this drive, its path would be squap opp web01 /c:. All
right. I guess I can sort of see from this already that going back to that perspective you just showed, if I've got squap op web01, or if I have an object of any computer type, I should be looking for all of the things that are hosted on it of type Windows Logical Disk, right? And that's how I should express wanting to show disks for computers.
This is also why things like if you go to the Advanced tab on the scope and put like a group in and then say, but show me all disks, how SCOM is able to find them all. Because it will start at your Microsoft Windows computer and say, well, I contain things. Do those things contain disks? And and SCOM will traverse that sort of hierarchy. So it doesn't matter necessarily how deeply it's buried. It will eventually find that object. Incidentally, that's why you should be careful with very high top level groups like the management group and things, because they often tend to contain everything.
And just a quick one before you move on, where do applications, so distributed applications, sort of fit in? Are they computer-like or group-like?
They're group-like, actually. Funnily enough, DAs are system.service. The only difference between them and a group is that the SCOM console knows to show them in two different views. Otherwise, they're exactly the same. Like you can scope SCOM views or alert notifications or everything else at DAs and groups, and there's no real difference.
Sure.
So let me sort of show how this can be a bit easier to understand, because I've sort of shown these slides, but I've kind of pulled this information out of nowhere. If I go back over to Squared Up, I'm actually going to jump to an object now. I'm going to jump to my SCOM database. There we go.
So you're going to sort of show us this sort of live in action just by browsing around in Squared Up, right?
So by now everyone's probably familiar. This is a database. This is the operations manager database. If I flip to the monitored entity perspective, which is the default perspective that's configured, everyone's hopefully seen this view by now in Squared Up. We can sort of show some of the things we just talked about in action here on this tile. So the first thing we've got here is the hosting stack. So this hosting stack is showing us from this current object, which is the database at the top, what the hosting hierarchy for this object is. So in this case, it's a database. It lives on a particular SQL instance, very helpfully named, and then it lives on top of a particular computer. So that's what that hosting stack is kind of showing you here. This database is tied to all of these individual objects.
But it doesn't show the containments, like the groups, because there's probably many different groups that contain that server and so on. And it goes maybe a bit too far. So this is just specifically the hosting. And it makes sense, right? You've got the sort of server at the bottom hosting a database engine that hosts a database. Yep.
And if you look on the side, we've got the properties of the database class. So we can see here it has a name, it has whether it's auto-growing, that kind of thing. And these properties will come from the class model as well. So you might have very sort of generalized database classes that just say databases have a name. And then you'll have very specific ones lower down that will say, okay, actually, SQL 2012 databases have a particular setting that they're going to surface. So that's the hosting hierarchy. Under here, we've got the class list. This actually shows you all the different classes that this object counts as. So basically, very quickly, objects in SCOM have a class hierarchy. So you have every object has a class. This is a Windows Server 2012 DB because our SCOM database is hosted on a Windows, on a SQL 2012 server. And that class is also of type database because it's defined as having its parent its type of being a database. That's defined as a generic database. That could be an Oracle DB or anything else. That's just defined as an application component, which is a configuration item. Think like ITSM style config items, so whether it's deployed or not, that kind of thing. And then eventually you have object. Everything eventually is an object. Now what this means at a very high level is if I targeted a perspective at SQL Server 2012 DB, it would only show up on 2012 DBs. If I target it at SQL database, it would show up on all SQL databases, irrespective of version. And if I target it as a object, it would show up on everything.
And I guess it's worth noting that's different from the hosting stack, right? The hosting stack is showing kind of the relationships to other objects, right? Ops Manager on SQL Server on SQL SQL 1, whereas these are all describing the operations manager object. It is a SQL Server 2012 DB. It is a database. So although there's a list there and it looks like it's sort of hierarchical, it's just describing this one object, whereas the hosting stack above is showing you the objects that it's hosted on.
Yes, it's sort of its parents, if you think about it that way. Now, the other thing is if I scroll down, we've got this children and parents sections. So these are quite cool. This basically shows all the objects underneath, so either contained or hosted underneath this object. So in this case, it's a database. Databases have logs and file groups. So that's what we're actually seeing here. SCOM doesn't just say, okay, database is an individual object. It itself has child objects that reflect how healthy each individual log file or data file is. And here we can see the parents. And what you've got here is there's the hosting relationship to the SQL server. And then, as you said, there's all the rest of the containment relationships it's also got. So it's also in a couple of different groups. It's in an out-of-the-box group that comes with the SQL Manager pack. Another one over here as well. And it's also part, in this case, of a distributed application that's been called SLO. So we can see here this would get quite noisy quite quickly. And you can imagine if I went to like a Windows computer and looked at that, there's like 30 different things it's a part of. So sometimes it can be a little bit noisy if you don't know exactly what you're looking for when you're looking through this list. So that kind of shows sort of at a low level how Squared Up shows some of this information. And you can navigate through this fairly easily by clicking on the hosting stack. So I can drill down on any of these objects here. I could go through its parents and figure this stuff out. But often that's a bit clunky, right? And with no context of what these objects actually are, sometimes it can be really messy to do that. So what I want to do now is start talking about some tile scoping where we can create some perspectives to kind of make sense of some of this noise.
And great, and actually this view here is similar to what we had in version 2 of Squared Up. It was generic, right? Every object looks like this, this view, applies to every single object you look at, whether it's a database or a disk or a server. And it has all the information there. That's very like, you've had to explain SCOM kind of concepts for us to understand that. So it's very sort of SCOM information. And really the whole point of perspectives is to take all that same information and then format it in a way that makes sense to, in this case, a SQL DBA.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, that's it.
So if I jump back here, go to my tile scoping. So when you configure a perspective, as you're adding tiles, the scope section of that tile is going to keep asking you if you want to use one of several options. So you have this object. This is the simplest one and it's the default one, and basically says whatever the tile is, whatever the perspective is currently pointing at, that's what I'll show you. So if you're creating a perspective for a computer, it's going to show you status information or performance metrics for this computer. The next one, the powerful one that we're really looking at here, is relative. So this is where we're saying, I don't want to see this object, I want to see a parent or child of this object. And you have two options when you set that, direct or recursive. So basically, do I want to just look at its immediate parent or children, or do I want to go all the way through the stack, potentially many, many levels looking for something? I'll show you when you should configure those. A lot of the time you'll be picking all levels, but if you don't have to, don't, because there is a performance cost to doing that. So your dashboard's going to be slightly quicker if you know you can choose direct.
Just a sort of on terminology here, because we saw children and parents in that last sort of non-identity tab we just saw. That sort of it's basically going up a relationship or sort of down a relationship, and it's not specific to hosting or containment. So anything that is either hosting something or contained within something is a parent. Anything that it hosts or contains is a child. So it's just sort of going up and down a sort of relationship, and all those relationships, I guess we should say, are directional. Right, it's something contains something or something hosts something, rather than sort of bidirectional. And the direct or recursive, I think in the UI, is it one level and all levels?
Yes,
is the terminology. Yeah. Okay. So just that means the same thing. Direct means as in it's an immediate parent or an immediate child, one level down. Recursive means look all the way down
through my entire family tree,
which can go in some cases quite far, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last one you have is other specific object. It's not always useful, but often it could be great if you're building a perspective for a particular object and you know it's part of a particular application or there's a particular group that's relevant to this. Just go and pull that in. Maybe we'll have a coffee break on use of that in the future, but like I said, it's quite sort of niche case.
I'm just trying to think, I don't know, if you're looking at a SQL database, then you might want to say, well, here's the status of the SQL database group, right? That applies to every SQL database. So it's one particular object that you always want to show on that particular perspective.
The other one that's quite helpful is if you're looking at a web application monitor, and you know that your application, there's a DA for every single web application monitor you've got, and they're formatted in a certain way or whatever. Just say other object, it's that one over there. So that when you're looking at a web monitor, you can say, okay, well, this is the health of the transaction, but what's the health of the whole app? Okay, let's actually dive into doing something with the product. So what I'm going to do is create a perspective that shows software installed on a particular server and the parent application it's part of. So the idea is I'm on a server, granted the perspectives along the top allow me to see sort of what roles it has, but what about if it's got particular agents installed, or it's a server that's multidisciplinary, hosting lots of different things, or potentially part of multiple different applications, what's actually on this? So let's jump over to SQL 3.
How are you choosing a server here? Does it matter?
No, it doesn't. This is any server. What I'm doing is I'm picking a server that I know has a bunch of stuff installed, so the output of this will look fairly interesting once we're done. Okay, so we've got our perspectives that are applying to that. This is a SQL server, but I might not want to create perspectives specifically for various different agents and everything like that. So if I want to roll up the health of everything, I could go over to monitor identity and then scroll down, but when it loads up here, you're going to see you've got a lot of different, there we go. Here's all these children. A lot of these are named the same thing as the computer because that's what SCOM objects tend to do in management packs that didn't really think that one through. And likewise with the parents, we've got all these different objects. Some of these are groups, some of these are DAs. What is
hard to interpret?
It's very hard to interpret this. So let's create a new perspective. I'm going to call this software. I want to apply this to the class Windows Server. So any Windows Server, show the software installed on it. Next. Now, caveat, this will require SCOM to have discovered that particular piece of software. So it's not like Config Manager where it's going to show anything installed from an admin.
We'd need data on demand for that, wouldn't we, Matthew?
Yeah, we would indeed. So let's show the OS first, because bizarrely in SCOM, the operating system isn't actually part of the computer.
All right, you do that, and I'll try and explain that. That's an odd one, right? And I think that probably catches out almost anyone who hasn't worked with SCOM before, which is they expect to look at a computer and they expect to see CPU and memory and so on for that computer. But actually, in the SCOM world, there is another object called the operating system object that is hosted on that computer, so like a disk. So a computer has an operating system and also has disks. So computer hosts an operating system, and it's actually the CPU and the memory and so on are actually on the operating system object, and the health. So for example, if you have high CPU and it goes red, it actually makes the operating system object go red, and then that rolls up to the computer object. So that's a classic one. I think when I first picked up SCOM, it's like, why do you have to overcomplicate this? And yeah, I guess hopefully through perspectives, you can then simplify that back down again, which is on the perspective ribbon there, we've got Windows Server 2012, which shows you all your operating system metrics. But for someone who's not a SCOM expert, they just go to a computer, they look at the Windows Server 2012 tab, and they see all the metrics they need. Okay, I was talking for a while then, and you're just clicking around. So what were you clicking on?
So I've done so far is I created a column and added 2 tiles. So what I want to show here is on the left, I'm going to show the local application. So that's typically agents. So your AV agent, your SCOM agent, that kind of thing. And on the right, I'm going to show the server roles that are actually installed. Because often, like you think of an application server, you might say, oh, it's a SQL server, right? But in reality, like you might have 5 or 6 different roles that make that up. Does it have analysis services, reporting services, and all that sort of stuff installed as well? So
is it worth just opening up the operating system because we can see the results there already? And I was just talking through that. How was that configured?
Oh yeah, sorry. So I hit relative objects because I want to show something that's related to this computer. I want to show the children of this because the computer contains the operating system,
hosts the
operating system. And then underneath that, I said one level because I know it's directly related.
Yeah.
If I hit all levels, it would still work, but it would take a bit longer because it's now going to go all the way down the hierarchy.
Look for something that's an operating system. Yeah. And then you typed in class.
Yeah, I put in operating system and it showed up a different list of stuff.
I think if you choose one level, it sort of suggests it can look at the class of everything that's one level child, and hence you have a drop down you can choose. But if it's all levels, Squared Up doesn't do that because it could be a very large list.
Yeah, you could be there for a very long time waiting for that one. So I put an operating system, and then IntelliSense said, "Oh, you mean the operating system?"
Great, and there it is.
Yep, exactly. So that was nice and easy. This one's a bit more complicated. So I want to show local applications. I happen to note that I've gone and browsed to one earlier on, and it showed the class name as being local application. So I'm going to do that here.
So you used that monitoring entity view to look at the classes of the thing you're interested in, and then you knew what to put in here.
So you've got local application and Windows local application. Now, because this perspective is targeted at Windows servers, it doesn't actually matter which one of these I picked. But if I had a perspective that was targeted generically at just servers, Linux and Unix, if I pick Windows local application, that wouldn't work on Unix servers. So here, local application is fine. Generally, you can usually go for the more abstract versions, and it's fine to do that. So there we go. There we can see some of the local applications. If we have time, I'll show how to clean this up a bit further. And let's do the same for server roles. So I go over here.
So not this object, because actually before you do that, you can see the results there when you've selected this object shows this object, which is the server, which obviously you probably don't want to do.
No, right, I've already got it up here. What's the point in that?
Typically you always do want to show relative.
So again, one levels. In this case, it's role. There we go, computer role. So roles, and just in case you haven't encountered these class names before, roles are, think of like a role as one of the few things the server does. Roles typically are pieces of software that you install or services that you enable, and you don't tend to install multiple roles on one server. So IIS, Exchange, SharePoint, that kind of thing. Applications are small bits of software that you install. They're often like management agents, or you could install feasibly lots of them, and they don't typically tend to inform what the server actually does. So if you look at the difference here, like over here we've got like the cluster service, the fact that there's the health service agent or the APM agent over here, whereas over here we've got SQL instances. Now this is all very well and good. I'm actually going to show this as a bit of bonus content. We've got enough time quickly. I've got a custom label. If you haven't seen custom labels before, go back and watch the coffee break.
Was
on
that the very first coffee break, or one of the
first ones? Yeah. Now I've got a custom label here that will clean this up a bit. If I go in here and go to labels, the problem is we're seeing the name of the server half the time. If I go to custom,
because the object has the same name, right? It's not sort of we're showing the server name. It's just that the management pack decides to use the same name.
So if I click on the moustache helper here, I look down here under classes, I do actually have the display names of the classes listed.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
So I'm just going to paste in a moustache. Boom. And what this does is it shows the class name first, and then if the display name isn't actually the same as the path, basically if the application isn't just called the same thing as the computer anyway, then we'll show that name as well. So you can see, for example, here's the SCOM health service, here's the APM monitoring agent. Those had the same name as the computer, so I'm not bothering to show it. But here we can actually see that these ones had a specific name. Still not very helpful, but at least now can understand if these were installed multiple times, what they are. It'll make a lot more sense on the server roles.
Nice use of custom labeling. While you're doing that, I was going to sort of pull up, I think it was another thing I certainly sort of was confused by when I first picked up SCOM, which is a computer, so say like SquapOp SQL 03, is not of type SQL computer.
No.
Right? It's of type Windows computer. And then actually it hosts an object. So going back to that relationships and the objects, it hosts an object that says this is a SQL computer role. And I guess, because this server, as you can see here, isn't just a SQL server, it's also where you've got a server role there, which is a Hyper-V VM role, essentially. So it sort of shows what else this server is doing, not just a SQL server.
Yep.
So when you think about, I think that the SQL computers group, for example, the rule is it's showing computers that host an object of type SQL server role. Yeah.
Yep, so we can see in the completed example here now, look, we've got a SQL DB engine, but we've also got, this is a failover cluster. This has also got integration services installed, and you mentioned it's running on Hyper-V. And it's also got file shares potentially on there too. So now we can really understand what's going on with this. Now, I know we're running late to time, so I'll do a very final one. Parent applications. I've got a server. I know what's installed in it now. Brilliant. What's it actually part of? What's it doing? Well, in the same way that we can show children, we can also show parents. And this time I'll have to use the recursive relationship. So I created a new status tile called parent applications. I'm going to say relative objects. I want to show its parents. Now I can't go one level up because inside DAs, you've got component groups that contain like, your servers or your databases or your web application monitors or whatever. So here I need to hit all levels. And if I type in service, which is the display name of DAs, I don't know why they called that, but there we go. So crunch away for a second. And as I mentioned, because it's going all levels, it's a bit slower. And now it will show me all the DAs this is part of. So if I hit done and flip this over to the nice horizontal view, there we go. Now I can see from this what's installed in this server, what OS version it is. I can also see the parent apps. So now if something goes wrong with this thing, I know, okay, well, these are the applications that it actually impacts. It impacts Sales app, rather than just seeing, all the groups that it contains, which are kind of meaningless.
And again, all that information was there on the monitored entity tab, or you can sort of, kind of click around and find it. But that's really hard to do, and this is something that anyone could sort of click on and understand.
Absolutely.
Great.
And this is often quite important when looking at things like network devices, for example, because they will be it's a network device and it'll have interfaces, they'll be their own object, it'll have ports, they'll be their own object. So you don't typically want to keep drilling down all the time. So understanding this sort of stuff is really key there.
Great, very powerful.
So that's kind of drawing that to a close. I'm sorry, we went a little bit over time. So hopefully this will help you sort of understand what that tile scoping section is, how you can make use of it, and how you can start really building out these sort of relational perspectives that show you the full picture of what a particular object is doing and what it's up to. Okay, let's jump back and wrap up. So, as always, we've got our Squared Up Coffee Break topic survey. We've already gone through a couple of different things people have asked for now. If you haven't yet done the survey, please head over to squaredup.com/topics, where you can vote on future topics that you'd like to hear us cover, and also suggest new topics if there's something you think we've missed and you'd like to know more about. If you go to our microsite on Coffee Break series, then you can see the future topics that are coming up, and there's also a registration form. So if you think this kind of stuff's useful and you know a colleague or someone else who'd be interested in this sort of stuff, you can sign them up.
Just going to add in, actually, we've got some pretty good stuff coming up. Probably sneak in some previews of 3.2 maybe. Probably show off some things sort of live on a webinar that will be sort of first seen live on a coffee break. Shout out to George last week, who was on live on the coffee break, filled in the survey, won a cool Star Destroyer, Stargazer Lego set. Not sure what it was, but joined live, answered some questions live, and sort of won some Lego. So please do sort of try and join us as often as you can, and hopefully there'll be some nice sort of preview snippets coming up. Yeah, it should be really good. I can't wait for that. So our recordings and slides are published via our blog, so you can get all the content, including this slide deck and samples there. And we also have a YouTube playlist now, where you can go back and review previous coffee breaks, because no doubt we're going to keep saying over and over again, go back and check out a previous coffee break when we're doing something. Now, for those of you who are live, the technical team are online, as are myself and Richard, so we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. It's not just about getting free Lego coming to these, you can also actually talk directly with the guys who make Squared Up. And otherwise, have a great day, and thanks for joining us. Thanks.